we visited the Carter Center in May 2023, Tony Clark graciously offered to be our tour guide. At the time, Jimmy Carter was 98 years young, but he did not pass away until late December in 2024, shortly after his 100th birthday. He was the oldest living president. In the first of our series on this tour, Tony told us many personal stories about Jimmy Carter when he was growing up in a small farm in Archer, Georgia, and attending school in nearby Plains, and his marriage to Rosalind Carter, and how he served on a nuclear submarine in the Navy. When his father passed away, he resigned from the Navy, and the Carters moved back to Plains, Georgia, to run the family farm and business.
When Carter went back to Plains, he hadn't thought about getting involved in politics, but a guy was running for governor saying he'd rather shut down the schools than integrate them. So Carter decided to run for the state senate, but there was a county official who really stuffed the ballot box, hid other ballot boxes, and Carter didn't concede.
Is that Lester Maddox right there?
Yes,
yeah.
That's Lester Maddox.
He's the segregationist.
When he runs for the state senate, he challenges the results in court and ends up being seated in the state senate. He serves 2 terms in the state senate, runs for governor, actually does lose, and runs again and wins, and surprised a lot of folks when he said in his inaugural address, "I say to you quite frankly, the time for racial discrimination is over," because he had not run as someone who was ready to desegregate. In fact, his lieutenant governor is Lester Maddox, who built a name for himself by being a very vocal segregationist. You could only be governor for 1 term at the time. So Carter's aide, Hamilton Jordan, wrote out a 90-some page memo about here's how you become a national political figure. And he laid it out, going to all the states for primaries and caucuses, and Carter did that, and that's how he went from being Jimmy Who to a viable presidential candidate.
Yeah, one thing when I was reading his 365-day devotionals, he was mentioning how he enacted some prison reform when he was governor, trying to make more educational opportunities available for the prisoners and discovering that many of the prisoners were mentally incapacitated.
Yeah, I mean, Carter did a whole new way of running for president. One of the things he did, he was friends with the head of Capricorn Records, and so he got musicians to perform at his events, to bring in young people. He did a lot with the Allman Brothers, I think Bob Dylan, John Denver, those sorts of things. And then one of the key things, when Carter went to Iowa and New Hampshire, he didn't have any money to campaign, which ended up being a good thing, because what he did is he took friends and neighbors from Plains. They became known as the Peanut Brigade. They stayed in people's homes, talked to them about their friend Jimmy Carter. And in Iowa, for example, where they have caucuses, that's how the caucuses work. It's a very personal kind of campaign, and that's what Carter gave them. He is thought of as Jimmy Who at the time, but by winning in Iowa and New Hampshire, he became a viable presidential candidate. He was on the cover of Time magazine. There were stories about the New South and Jimmy Carter and what he was doing to bring it. One of the contests that was really important was in Florida, the Florida primary, because you had George Wallace and Jimmy Carter. And when Carter was able to win in Florida, it showed that a Southerner could win without being a segregationist. And at that point, he really took over the race for the Democratic. You know, it's interesting, when Carter went as a candidate, the Congressional Black Caucus invited all the Democratic contenders to talk to them about their campaign. But they weren't going to invite Carter because he was from the South. off, and they thought they knew what he stood for. And so he got invited, Andy Young got him invited to the Congressional Black Caucus. And they talk and they disagree. And one of the questions, though, that they ask each one of the candidates is how many African Americans you have on staff. And most of them said, well, I've got one. One candidate was getting ready to hire one. And they asked Carter. And Carter said, I have got no idea. And the chairman was getting ready to get up and walk out. And Drew Young said, well, just wait a minute. They got one of the campaign managers over and said, well, how many African Americans are on the staff? He said, well, right now we only have 27. And he said, well, what are they doing? He said, well, so-and-so's in finance, so-and-so's in advance. They were spread throughout the campaign. And what I think it showed the Congressional Black Caucus is that Carter doesn't see people with eyes that define them by the color of their skin. It's what their talent is. That was something, when he wins the presidency, he put in more women and people of color than any previous president. Jimmy Carter had a tough race with Gerald Ford for the presidency. But it's interesting that this picture from the inauguration, you've got Carter doing his inaugural address, but the first thing he did was to thank Gerald Ford for the leadership that he gave coming out of Watergate, which is something that I don't think we have previously seen of the incoming president thanking the outgoing president. But you've got here all the major players: President Carter, President Ford, Mrs. Carter, Joan Mondale. Amy is about 12 years old there. She's actually reading a book, which is more interesting to her than political speeches at that point. But you've also got Walter Mondale and Nelson Rockefeller. You've got most of Carter's cabinet here. You've got Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow up there. Michael Dukakis, who later runs for president of the United States. Fred Harris from Oklahoma. Jerry Brown, later governor of California. You've got former Vice President Humphrey and his wife Muriel, and they're right up front because he was Walter Mondale's mentor. You've got Carter's top aides, Jody Powell, Hamilton Jordan. You even have Shirley Temple Black, who was ambassador to the United Nations at that point. And Carter did something that no president had done before. He walked from the inauguration to the reviewing stand. They got out of the cars and walked. So you've got Carter and the kids. You've got President Carter and Mrs. Carter. You've got their oldest son, Jack, and his son, Jason, who's now head of the Carter Center Board of Trustees. You've got Chip and Jeff. And one of the interesting things to me is you've got this guy. This is Jerry Parr. He is a Secret Service agent. 4 years after this, he will actually save Ronald Reagan's life. When Reagan gets shot after a speech, he gets him into the presidential limousine, pats him down, sees he's been wounded, and gets him to GW Hospital, which actually saves Reagan's life. The coats the three of them are wearing are actually over here. President Carter's coat wasn't his coat. When he was in Iowa or New Hampshire, it was very cold and he didn't have a heavy overcoat. So Jerry Rafshoon, his media advisor, loaned him his coat, and Jimmy Carter never gave it back. In fact, at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, Carter asked Jerry if he wanted his coat back. Jerry said, well, you've had it so long, you might as well keep it. Mrs. Carter caught a lot of criticism over her dress at the inauguration. Not that it isn't a pretty dress, but it's the same dress she wore when he was inaugurated governor. And the fashion police believe one inauguration, one dress. You have another inauguration, you should wear another dress. In fact, the last time I was in Washington, it was on display at the Museum of American History, and it had a tag on it that said she wore it twice.
And then, of course, you have Amy Carter there.
There they are. And there's another thing. This is James Dickey. James Dickey did the inaugural poem. He is also the author of the book Deliverance, which became a movie shot in Georgia. And it was shot and released when Carter was governor. And Carter and Jerry Rafshoon, his media advisor, thought, well, you know, this is bringing a lot of attention and a lot of money to Georgia. We ought to do something to encourage movie making in Georgia. So they helped establish the Georgia Film Commission. And because of that, Georgia is now one of the top locations in the country for filming movies, all because of what Jimmy Carter and Jerry Rafshoon did for the state of Georgia.
Jimmy Carter's autobiography and daily devotions include these stories from his years in Georgia politics. More detail how he successfully challenged in court the count in the counties where the votes were grossly miscounted in his state senate election, how he promoted civil rights when many in Georgia believed in the separation of the races, and how he streamlined the government agencies as governor and put the state on a sounder financial footing, and the prison reforms enacted when he was governor. Next, we will continue our tour of the Carter Center, reflecting first on Jimmy Carter's presidency and then his post-presidential endeavors, including peacekeeping, election monitoring, and public health missions as head of the Carter Center. Although there's some overlap, our guided tour, Jimmy Carter's autobiography, and his daily devotions each have unique stories and insights.